Welcome to another edition of the Petty Podcast. This is your host, Stephen Petty. Today's presentation is the first of a two-part set of podcasts entitled CDC and the ASTM Mask Standard. This came out towards the middle of last year, but I don't know that many people have covered it. And this was an area where CDC is really desperate in some respects to have justification for masks, and they've endorsed, if you will, this ASTM Mask Standard. But I think it's important to look at the endorsement letter in the first part and then the Mask Standard itself in the second part. So that's what we're going to do. The standard itself came out in April 23rd of 2021 or so, and it was there was a statement on the CDC webpage, which is indicated here. It was put together by these three authors talking about the standard itself. And many of the key statements they make about it are highlighted, and we'll go into those in detail. CDC cited a new mask ASTM standard. They claimed the standard is a consensus standard, but interestingly enough, dropped the word national used by OSHA to define a true national consensus standard. It's clearly not a national consensus standard. And interestingly enough, the ASTM standard itself admits that it does not cover respirators or PPE. In other words, the mask standard isn't they aren't respirators and they're not PPE. An interesting concession. The ASTM standard uses a perfectly sealed mask in its test procedure and provides no guidance on how to correct for gaps observed in real-world mask wearing. And the ASTM standard accepts greater than 20 to greater than 50% stopping of aerosols using a perfectly sealed mask, not the 90% relative risk suggested by AHA in their September 2020 guidance. In other words, we don't want to just protect less than half the people. I mean, that's terrible guidance. Why in the world would you suggest a solution that over half the people are not protected? And secondly, there's no concentration criteria in the standard for aerosols in the testing. In other words, what are the size of the particles and how many are present? And then you need a starting point to know the effectiveness. Effectively, from a health and safety perspective, it's my opinion the standard is essentially useless. Key statements in the CDC statements. It says, unlike respirators and surgical masks, the masks worn to help protect the spread of COVID don't have to meet federal standards to confirm their performance. Well, why not? It's presumed that if they're endorsing this is going to help. But why shouldn't they have to meet federal standards to impose masks on people nationwide? I think they should. They also say while barrier face coverings, this is the new terminology, BFCs, are not respirators or surgical masks, they may, interesting word may, prevent the wearer from spreading larger droplets that carry infectious organisms such as virus and the COVID-19. So CDC in their own statement is admitting that these are not respirators, they're not even surgical masks. They use the term may. Well, from an engineering, science, or even from a legal standpoint, the word may never shows up. You have the word probable or possible or certain or uncertain, not certain. So probable means 50% or better, or more likely than not. And possible means greater than 0%. Well, the word may is sort of like the word possible. And the other thing is they keep focusing on that word droplets. And I'll keep hammering on them by saying it's not a droplets issue, as you'll know from my earlier podcasts. It's an aerosol issue, particles less than 5 microns. So an interesting statement. And remember from my earlier podcasts that in order for something to really be effective from an industrial hygiene standpoint, and that includes COVID in terms of relative risk reduction, you want solutions that provide at least a 90% or better risk reduction. They're admitting up front with perfectly sealed masks they don't. And we also know that you need engineering controls to do that sort of thing. So AIHA admits that with relatively conservative assumptions about gaps and wearing of masks, that the risk reduction is on the order of 5 to 10%. It certainly doesn't meet that 90% threshold. What else do they say in this statement? They say that it's a consensus standard and that they have gotten input from NIOSH. Well, this is misleading because, first of all, OSHA, for example, doesn't use the term consensus standard. They use the term national consensus standard. So they've left off the word national. And they've also used the word with input from. Well, that's not adoption by or agreement by NIOSH. It's a way to try to imply or persuade you that somehow or other NIOSH or OSHA agree with this. And obviously they don't. Otherwise they would have their own standard out there. So let's look a little bit at what OSHA actually says for a national consensus standard. I thought it'd be interesting to actually do some homework here. And so I went out to OSHA 29 CFR 1910.2 definitions, and I looked up the definition for a national consensus standard. What does it say? National consensus standard means, now note, CDC only uses the word consensus standard, not national. Means any standard or modification thereof which has been adopted or promulgated by a national recognized standards producing organization under procedures where it may be determined by the Secretary of Labor or the Assistant Secretary of Labor that persons interested or affected by the scope of the provisions have reached substantial agreement on its adaptation. I've worked on consensus standards on ASHRAE, and we have to reach agreement with any commenter. We have to put it out for review. Anybody can comment on it, and we have to reach agreement with those commenters, or that part of the standard can't go forward. This has never done that. Stay tuned for part 2, where I'll actually cover the actual standard, which I think you'll find even more illuminating. Appreciate you watching. Have a great day.